it is safe to say that July was a very prolific reading month for me. I read 18 books, which is amazing, and luckily I'm happy to report that a lot of them were pretty good, and there is one in there that I have now labelled my favourite book of all time, so keep your eyes peeled for that. If you are new here, I am Amy and this is Amy's Bookshelf. So yeah, like I said, I read a lot of books in July. I was actually on holiday for the first week of July, and it was like a all-inclusive hotel, beach read, sort of, you know, didn't really do much all week. Unfortunately, I got food poisoning 3 days in, but it did mean that I read 11 books in a week, which is incredible and kind of crazy. So yeah, you know, all's well that ends well. I'm just gonna take the good because having food poisoning wasn't the best, but we move on. As always, for my wrap-ups, I'll go through them one by one, tell you what I rated them, tell you a bit about what I thought of them, and hopefully I will pique your interest and give you some recommendations. And if you have read any of them, please let me know in the comments so we can discuss. So let's get into it. Okay, so first up is actually an audiobook read, and it is The Uncertain Sea by Bonnie Tsui. Now I listened to this on the plane on the way out to my holiday in July. It's only an hour long and it is a Scribd original, so annoyingly I can't put it on my Goodreads list. So if you ever notice, I don't know if you're nosy, that my Goodreads tally and the tally I put on my Instagram are different, it's because not all of the books that I have read this year are on the Goodreads database, because for whatever reason they refuse to put Scribd originals on there. So that's why the tally doesn't match up. Not my fault, I'm just going with it because I've emailed Goodreads, they have done nothing about it, whatever. Anyway, so like I said, it's a Scribd original, it's only about an hour long, and it was a really interesting read. So it's called The Uncertain Sea, it's a non-fiction read, and it is basically Bonnie Tsui telling a story of a diver that she interviews both before and after the pandemic. Now, a lot of the book surrounds the idea of fear. So she talks to this diver, and actually he started off, I believe, as a fisherman, if I remember correctly, and then because of his fascination with sharks, he then moved on to more of like a photography, being like a photography diver, and I think a semi-like conservationist, because he was tracking the sharks, watching their behaviour, documenting their behaviour, and helping, you know, conserve the sharks and look after them. So when she interviews him, she talks a lot about his encounters with sharks, what he makes of doing that for a job, and just his experiences in the sea and with these amazing creatures. Now we find out pretty early on that this diver actually was the victim of a shark attack. So a lot of it surrounds the idea of how he was able to get back in the water and how much that impeded his ability to continue doing his job. And I really loved his outlook on life. And I think sharks, not that I know much about sharks, but what I do know about sharks is I think as a society, we really exaggerate how dangerous they actually are. Now, obviously they are dangerous creatures, as in they are capable of doing a lot of damage, but statistically, you are not likely to be attacked by a shark. You are way more likely to be hit by a bus, to fall off a cliff taking a selfie, and doing various other things that have actually caused people either severe injury or death from doing. So sharks get a bit of a bad rep, and I think this book was very helpful if you have a fear of sharks or if you are worried about shark attacks. It is quite a helpful view to hear firsthand from someone that has been attacked and still defends the creatures. Now, the book wasn't just about sharks. I briefly spoke about COVID, and it also does talk a lot about the fear of COVID in society, and that part of the book was really, really fascinating. And yeah, like I said, Bonnie Tsui's point of view and also this diver's point of view, just really interesting to listen to as a whole piece. And it was just a really interesting read. Like I said, it's only an hour long, it's really not long at all. So if you have Scribd or you're thinking of signing up for Scribd, then I really recommend the Scribd originals generally, but also The Uncertain Sea. If you haven't signed up for Scribd before, then you can use the referral code in my description. You get 2 months for free and I get a month for free, so it's win-win. And there's so many books on there that you can read. It's a really great audio platform. It's probably my favourite audio platform actually, because although it's not unlimited books, so Audible, for example, probably has more books on their database that you don't have access to every book on the Scribd database. It changes on a month by month basis. However, for what you pay every month, you can listen to unlimited number of books. So as many as you want, which is obviously so much better value for money than something like Audible, where you pay £9 or whatever it is and you get 1 credit. And I know they have their unlimited library, but it's very restricted. And this isn't an ad, I genuinely just like scribd. Anyway, I've completely gone off on a tangent here, but The Uncertainty was really good and I believe I rated it 4 stars, so would recommend. Next up on my list is Pandoras Jar by Natalie Haynes. This is actually another non-fiction read. So I have read one other book by Natalie Haynes, which is 1,000 Ships. So Pandoras Jar was recommended to me by one of my book clubbers and it just sounded really fascinating. So it essentially goes through the stories of, I think, about 10 different women or groups of women from Greek mythology, and essentially tries to shine a light on their real stories and how a lot of them have been given a bad rap by men and by the people who have told Greek mythology stories throughout time. Now, going into this, I have read a lot of feminist Greek retellings. So I've read Ariadne, I've read The Silence of the Girls, Circe, and a lot of Greek retellings which are about women told by women. And I've always loved them, and I've always loved how they have a different way of telling the story and you can kind of see it from a different point of view, especially if it changes what you previously thought you knew about these stories. And that's definitely what this book does. Now, they aren't all women I was very familiar with. Some of them I was, some of them I wasn't. So some examples of ones that I were: Phaedra, who is Ariadne's sister, she gets a chapter in this. Medusa, I'm familiar with her. Eurydice, I know a lot about her because of Orpheus and Eurydice and Hades Town. So I was familiar with some of the stories, but some of them I was less familiar with. In particular, I'll just have a look to double check. Jocasta, didn't know much about her. Clytemnestra and Medea, I think they were probably ones I was less familiar with, so it was interesting to hear their stories too. Now, in particular, what I loved about this book, and it was a really tiny section, but it's honestly stayed with me. Ever since I've read this, it has stayed with me, and that is talking about Greek myth retellings and how we are first exposed to them as children. Often we hear stories from a man's point of view and the women are either just the wives, the children, or the other people in the story. The stories don't centre around them. This does centre them in their own stories, which is brilliant. But then it also, like I said, kind of talks about how a lot of the time when we hear their stories from the man's point of view, they are made out to be the villains, to be the monsters, to be the people that are impeding the hero's story. And going back to what I found interesting is if we tell Greek stories or Greek mythology stories to children in children's books, we really have to censor what we put in them. So as you know, if you've read any Greek mythology retellings that are adult stories, they are full of rape, they are full of sexual assault, they are full of murder, violence, and a whole host of really awful things. Those kind of things cannot be put in children's books for obvious reasons. So they really have to be censored and really died down. So if you take someone like Hades, for example, who is married to Persephone and who Persephone is forced to live in the underworld for half of the year, when we tell that story in a children's book, we talk about how Hades brought her down to the underworld, and a very kind of light telling of that story. But we know from reading the actual story that he raped and abused her and that he really wasn't a saint, let's say. It's a very interesting line of thought because when children are first exposed to Greek mythology, the men do seem like heroes because we have to take out all of the rape, we have to take out all the violence, and they don't know about that until they're older. Like I said, I just cannot stop thinking about that particular part of this book, and I thought that was so fascinating. And generally this book is really great. Natalie Haynes is an incredible writer, and it was all done very well. I think I also gave this 4 stars and I absolutely loved it. Okay, next up is a bit lighter. It is The Meet Cute Diary by Emery Lee, and this is a new adult romance. Now, going into this, I was kind of looking forward to something sort of light-hearted, fast-paced, cutesy, romantic, and I did get that for the most part. And what I did like about the book is that while it is light-hearted, it also deals with quite a lot of heavy themes in quite a good way. Now, the book is about Noah, who runs a blog anonymously where he posts queer meet-cute stories that are submitted by other people. But what everybody doesn't know is these stories are actually all made up by Noah himself. Now, somebody begins to unravel the truth and everything kind of comes crashing down for Noah. So the the book mainly centres around that storyline, but there's also other offshoots of the plot to do with Noah himself, to do with Noah's friends, the other people he meets during the story. And yeah, I think for me, the side characters were much better in this book than Noah himself. Noah as a character, to be honest, was not only unlikable, but made some really questionable choices. And I think we were supposed to like him, but I really didn't agree with how he was treating his friends. And that kind of made it hard for me to root for him. So I didn't love that. However, I did love his friends. I loved their relationships with each other, the things that they explored. There's a lot in this book about identity, about using and changing your pronouns, and I thought that was all done really brilliantly. I just couldn't really get on board with Noah as a protagonist, so unfortunately the book itself kind of fell flat for that reason, so I gave it 3 stars overall. Next is The Lion Game by Ruth Ware. If you don't know, I love Ruth Ware. I read The Turn of the Key I think 2 years ago, and then I read One by One, both of which were brilliant whodunits, really edge of your seat stuff, and yeah, just really great thrillers. The Lion Game is about a group of 4 girls who went to boarding school together, and years later as adults they are brought back to the town where the school was because a body is uncovered and they have something to do with it. Now, Ruth Ware is brilliant at thrillers. She's brilliant at edge of your seat, fast-paced plots. They are easy books to read in one sitting, even though they are quite chunky. But I have to admit, I was a little bit disappointed with The Lion Game, and similarly to the Meet Cute Diary actually, I think it's because a lot of the characters were quite unlikable. There was only really one character in this book that I actually liked and that I thought made good choices, and so the rest of them, I didn't really get why I cared about them. I didn't really care about the outcome of what happened to them, and I thought maybe they didn't deserve what they got, because that feels a bit harsh, but like I said, they just didn't make good choices, so it was hard for me to root for them, unfortunately. But like I said, Ruth Ware is a really brilliant writer. I still stand by her as my go-to like thriller writer, because she is great. I have a couple more of her books on my TBR and I will definitely be reading them, but for me, if I was going to suggest a Ruth Ware book, I wouldn't suggest The Lion Game, just because nothing really felt very unique about it. There was some plot points which I didn't love and I thought could have been done better, especially from a writer I know can have really clever plot points. So this one was a bit disappointing, and I also gave it 3 stars. Next is another non-fiction read, and that is Intensive Care by Gavin Francis. This is mainly surrounding the COVID pandemic, and specifically being a GP in the UK. So this is only a short read. I think it's just over 200 pages. Yeah, just over 200 pages. And it basically follows Gavin Francis as a GP, like I said, from about February 2020 right through the pandemic and everything that he had to experience dealing with patients, trying to help patients, and also as a GP trying to work with the NHS and trying to follow government guidelines, while also questioning the decisions that we as a country were making in order to protect ourselves from the virus. Now, obviously 2020 wasn't that long ago, it's now 2023, and obviously I lived through the pandemic as an adult, and as world events go, it's definitely one of the ones I'm going to remember the most because I've fully lived through it. However, for whatever reason, 2020 feels like a lifetime ago, and a lot of what Gavin was talking about, I just completely forgotten about. And as someone who lives in the UK, he was talking a lot about the decisions the government made, the various lockdowns we had, and how like our lives were affected week by week on the changing rules and guidelines that we were being told by the government. And I'd really forgotten what a roller coaster that was. And looking back, I'm sure everybody can agree it was a weird time in every country. But yeah, in the UK, I can completely see why there's a lot of I wouldn't go as far as to say bitterness, but some resentment, I think, from Gavin's point of view, because he had to work through this. He had to expose himself to potentially dangerous situations in order to treat patients, all because he wasn't necessarily provided the right protection. As a government, the UK wasn't really giving the correct guidance in order to keep people most safe. And then, of course, some people were choosing just to flout the rules entirely and not keeping themselves safe, and as a consequence, not keeping the country safe as a population. So yeah, loads of those points were really, really interesting. Also just really interesting from like a human point of view, because he talks specifically about patients that he had to deal with. So for example, old people who've lost their spouses, and then also on the other side, which was interesting, young people who were really struggling to be in isolation. So there's an example of a teenager who was really struggling with their mental health during the pandemic, and as the guidance said that in order to treat these patients, he would have to call them over the phone and, you know, discuss what they were going through. But he could see that this person in particular was really struggling, and so let them come into the surgery. This wasn't right at the beginning of the pandemic, but for a little bit further on, and let them come into the surgery to have a face-to-face consultation. And it's things like that where you really think, yeah, you can understand why he's made that decision, because that person's mental health was clearly not in a good way, and having a conversation with someone over the phone is just not a replacement for speaking to someone face to face. So those things were really interesting, and it was just interesting to see the pandemic from the point of view of someone who had to really work and live through it. I was quite fortunate, I have an office job, so when everybody was in isolation I was just working from home, which, you know, had its own struggles, but I definitely wasn't exposed to things in a dangerous way like frontline care workers were, such as GPs. So yeah, a really brilliant book, especially if you're interested in healthcare, if you're interested in like medical memoirs and COVID memoirs. Really thought it was good, and I gave this 4 stars. Next, a historical fiction, and that is The Miniaturist by Jessie Burton. This came quite highly recommended for me, so I was looking forward to it. It is set in the Netherlands in 1686, and it follows Nella, who is 18 years old, and she is married off to an older man, and begins to live with him and live as his wife. Now, there were quite a lot of like different elements to the book, one of which that I thought was perhaps done a bit unfairly was the miniaturist element of it. So the reason it's called The Miniaturist is because there's this house, this doll's house in Nella and her husband's house, that she gets various figures and miniature things created for. And somebody messaged me once I spoke about this online and said, yeah, for a book that's called The Miniaturist, I was really expecting more about the miniaturist, and I have to agree, it's a very unimportant point of the plot, and I really didn't get why, like, the focus of it, of the title, of the cover, going in, you think it's going to be much more about this doll's house, about the miniaturist. And to be honest, that as a whole plot, I think probably could have been removed. Like, it wasn't even that important to a lot of what happened, or the most interesting part either. There were a lot more interesting parts of the book, and actually it gets pretty dark, especially the ending, so warnings there. Perhaps look up the trigger warnings if you think that you don't want anything too heavy going, because yeah, there are parts of this that are pretty heavy. Overall I thought it was well written, but it was just a bit too messy, and like I said, for a book that's called The Miniaturist, there was surprisingly little about the miniaturist, so I think I would have rather it focused on that a little bit more, just so it met my expectations a little bit better, and overall I gave it 3 stars. Next up is 7 Days in June by Tia Williams, and this was probably one of my most anticipated reads of the year, because I just heard such good things. So many people spoke about how it was such a great romance, such a great second chance romance, and so I had very, very high hopes. Now, I wasn't disappointed, I'm not going to say that, because it was a good book, but it wasn't a 5-star read for me, and I think that was just because probably it was too hyped, and my expectations were just far too high, and in reality it was a good book, but I think if I'd gone in without knowing anything, it probably would have landed better with me. So like I said, the book is second chance romance, and it is about Eva and Shane, who have this whirlwind week-long romance when they're teenagers and then don't see each other again for I think like 10 years, 15 years. So yeah, they don't see each other in that 15-year stretch, and then by chance happen to reconnect 15 years later as adults. Now obviously their lives have moved on dramatically. They are both writers though, so they have sort of peripherally followed each other's careers, and both either unknowingly or consciously have included each other in their own books, because they were so impacted by this weak romance that they had when they were teenagers. Now, I really love the second chance romance part of it. It felt so realistic. Like, it felt like, yeah, that is exactly what would happen if life just gets in the way, because things do happen and they stop you from reconnecting with people that you perhaps do want to reconnect with, but your job, your career, or your life, your family, your health gets in the way. So honestly, as realistic romances go, I would really recommend this. It also just had such a like nice tone to it, such a a down-to-earth tone to it, and I really loved that. It did deal with quite a few heavy topics as well, and there were parts of the plot that I felt could have been explored more, especially because it's not that long of a book. Yeah, about 320 pages. And I know it's a romance and you don't want romances to go on for too long, but there were some really interesting elements to the book, especially with Shane, and I think they could have been explored a little bit more, just like fleshed out a bit more. Otherwise, they maybe didn't need to be there. But yeah, like I said, overall, Eva and Shane were really brilliant characters, and I did love the second chance romance part of it. I think my expectations were just too high, and I gave this 4 stars. Next is The Cabin by Jorn Lea Horst, and this is translated from Norwegian and set in Norway. Now, I didn't know much about this. I got it off a recommendation because I think it's been turned into a TV show, and because of that the book has become quite popular because obviously people are reading it after they've seen the TV show. Now, it's a detective thriller, and it is about a cold case that is basically reopened, I think about 15-20 years after it happens. And so because a body is found, and then, yeah, like I said, it opened this cold case from decades earlier. So I really like detective fiction anyway. I like a whodunit, I like a good thriller, so I was excited for this, and I have to say this was executed so brilliantly. Like, I had no idea where it was going. Even I think I had like 50 pages left of the book and I still had no idea how it was going to end, which I think is a sign of a really good thriller, because you don't want to feel cheated, you don't want to feel like you guessed the ending and like it was a bit of a waste of your time because you already knew what was coming. So I loved it for that, and it was also just brilliant because it was one of those books that felt really complicated but in a digestible way. Like, there were so many different parts to the characters, to the plots, to the murder cases, the cold cases. There were like so many different details, but not so much that you couldn't keep track of what was happening, but that it felt so satisfying when it all came together at the end. So yeah, I'm really excited to read more from this author, because I think this is like number 13 in the series or something, so there's loads to read, and I believe they can be read as standalone novels because it's just the same detective rather than the same stories. So yeah, I can't recommend this book enough, especially if you're looking for a new thriller, especially if you're looking for a good translated rec. And I do have to admit, not a lot of translated books that I've read are thrillers, so this is a great place to start if you're looking for one, and obviously I gave it 5 stars. Okay, now on to the star of the show, The End of Loneliness by Benedict Wells. So I spoke about at the beginning of this video that there was a book I have officially labelled as my favourite book of all time, and that is this one. Now, this is translated from German, and it's I don't think I can quite call it a contemporary because it spans a long period of time, so slightly historical fiction because I think it goes into like the 90s, or starts in the 90s or the 80s, and then it moves into the modern day. So it spans a lot of time because we follow the lives of the protagonist over that time. So the book is about our protagonist Jules and his brother and sister, who through a series of events end up in a boarding school as children. Now, prior to this, they are really close-knit, they are really close siblings, and on moving to this boarding school there is a lot of distance that grows between them, and they each sort of start their own separate lives, not feeling really tied to each other at all. And then from there we follow them into adolescence, into adulthood, into their careers, into the people that they become as adults. Now, we mainly follow Jules, but we do also hear a lot about his siblings, about his family and his friend Ava as well, and there's a lot that goes on between their dynamics and their relationships and a lot of different things that happen there, but I just adored it. Not only was it this amazing story about the human condition, about like the messy relationships we have with family, with friends, about how like often things don't go right, often we don't make the right choices, we regret the choices that we do make, but the things we end up with, the lives we end up living, they're pretty good, you know, they're not perfect, but they're just these messy, imperfect human lives. And I spoke about this book as well because the book that it took over as my favourite book was A Little Life. I loved A Little Life. I know a lot of people have criticisms about it. It's not a perfect book, but I loved it, and this book did take over A Little Life for the #1 spot. And actually it's kind of had some comparisons to A Little Life in that it follows a protagonist over a number of years, over their childhood, adolescence, adulthood, etc. And also about like their relationship to other people. But this book is not at all traumatic. You know, there are elements of trauma on the periphery, because, like I said, this follows a long period of time. So yes, sad things do happen to the characters, but we don't go into all the gory details. We don't dwell on that sadness either. Like, for a book where there is a bit of trauma, there is a bit of melancholy, it's actually quite a joyous book because it does focus on a lot of the happy elements of their lives. There's a dash of romance as well, so it really ticks a lot of boxes. And not only that, but as you can see by the tabs, it's just beautiful writing, like writing that just makes your heart really full. So I couldn't recommend this enough. As you know, I love reading translated books, so I am overjoyed by the fact that my favourite book of all time is now a translated read. I love that so much, and I will definitely be rereading this at some point because I just couldn't get enough of it. Next is Finlay Donovan Jumps the Gun, which is the third in the Finlay Donovan series. I've read the first two and I really loved them. They are just these silly thrillers about a suburban mum who accidentally gets hired as an assassin and for various reasons has to follow through with the job. So that's kind of where we are in book number 1, and book number 2 and 3 just sort of follow on from the same thing because she gets caught up in this world of assassins, of criminals, and yeah, everything that happens with them. Now, I have to admit, number 1 and 2, I think I either gave 5 or 4 stars. I really liked them. But by the time I've got to number 3, I think I'm getting a little bit bored of the overall tone of the book. Like, don't get me wrong, they're really easy books to read. They're really fun. If you don't think about them too much, if you don't think about like the plot holes or the logistics, they're really great. They are good plots and just fun books to read. But I think there were just too many like little quips and little unrealistic sort of plot points that I was just getting a little bit bored of. So I didn't love this one as much. It's still an easy book to read and I will still very much be recommending this series, especially for people who want something that's easy to read but still fun and a little bit like complex because it's a thriller. They are hard books to put down because they're just really easy to read. But yeah, I think maybe 3 might be enough, but I know that there are more coming out and I probably will read them. So I will let you know how I get on with the rest of them. I give this one 3 stars. Okay, next up was A Single Rose, which is by Muriel Barbary and is set in Japan but translated from French, and is about Rose, who has just turned 40 and leaves France to go to Kyoto to hear the reading of her father's will. This book, going in, I was looking forward to it being just sort of like a quiet narrative about grief, about life, but it was very messy. The like narrative structure is a bit all over the place because it swaps between these like whimsical and then plot-based chapters, and because of that I found it really hard to like stay grounded and actually understand what was going on. I think as a character study it's quite interesting because, like I said, it does explore things like grief, but in terms of a plot it was just completely lost on me. I really just couldn't get a grasp on it at all. And it's only a short read, it's about 160 pages, so I can't help but feel if it had been a bit more fleshed out and a bit easier to digest, then overall it just would have been more of an enjoyable book. I think I have to acknowledge that it was a well-written book and I did like sections of it. There were like snippets of it that I did enjoy, but overall it just wasn't executed in a way that I could appreciate, so I gave this one 3 stars as well. Okay, getting through them. Next is This Lovely City by Louise Hare, which is another historical fiction book. So the book mainly focuses on Laurie Matthews and Evie. So Laurie came over on the Windrush after the war and has found it sort of difficult to become accustomed to London or London life. So he was kind of led to believe that London was going to be this amazing city that was going to be really welcoming and it was going to be easy to find work and to live there, but that isn't what he found. What he found was a lot of racism, was a lot of prejudice, and overall just not a very easy life. Now when we meet Laurie, he is in a relationship with Evie. They are very happy together. Evie is half black and half white and she is raised by her white mother because her black father never actually knew that she existed. Evie's mother was ostracised from the family when they found out that she was pregnant by a black man. So they, as I said, we meet them and they are in this very happy relationship, but one day Laurie, while he's cycling through the city, finds a dead baby in a pond, lake, area of water, I can't quite remember, And because he's the one to find this baby, he is accused of killing it. Now, a lot of the book focuses on racial prejudice, mainly coming to fruition because this baby isn't white. And so the police assume, well, if it's a black baby and a black man found her, then he must be responsible for abandoning the baby there. There are a lot of elements of racial prejudice and racism generally that are explored in the book, not just about the baby, about various other parts of Laurie's life, Laurie's friend's life, of Evie's life as well, and all of them in general. Now, Laurie and Evie were really brilliant characters. I loved that. I loved their relationship, and I loved how we heard their points of view. And it's a very immersive book in terms of like being a historical fiction book and being set in the 50s. So I really loved it for that. Overall, I did enjoy the story, and I thought it was interesting and unpredictable. I did have an issue with it, and I can't really discuss it because it's something that happens right at the end, but there's a choice that the author makes at the end that I don't agree with, because I think it taints what we have learnt before then. I think it taints sort of everything we experienced in the book, and then it kind of just leaves you with a bit of like a sour taste in your mouth, which I didn't love. And I'm not really sure why the author chose to do it, because it has quite big repercussions for the protagonist as well. So yeah, it was an interesting choice to say the least. And maybe some people really like it. I'm sure I'm probably in the minority and that other people did really like it, so that's fine. I'm not going to criticise it too much for that, but because of that I couldn't really give it 5 stars, so I gave it 4 stars overall. Next up is another Scribd original, which is You're Cute When You're Mad by Celeste Headley. Now, as with the other Scribd original, it's only like an hour long. It's a really short read, and it mainly follows something, or a term, which I hadn't heard of before, which was benevolent sexism. So it talks a lot about feminism, about sexism generally, about like microaggressions and how sexism presents itself like on a day-to-day basis, but specifically about this benevolent sexism. An example of something like that would be something like a man holding a door open for a woman. Now, on paper, that kind of act isn't anything awful. It's definitely not something that's like overtly violent or overtly traumatizing for the person that they do it for, but the reason it's known as this benevolent sexism is because of what lies underneath. It's because of the implications that the man believes the woman is this inferior creature and that they need to hold the door open for her. So that's one of the examples that Celeste talks about, but there are various other ones as well, and she also talks about how benevolent sexism presents itself in the workplace, and also the tools and the things that you need to know in order to confront benevolent sexism and sexism generally as well, actually. So yeah, it was a really interesting read because I'd never heard of this term before and I just wanted to learn a little bit more about what it was. So yeah, very good for that point of view, and I gave it 4 stars. Next is The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea by Yukio Mishima. This is translated from Japanese. This is a very short read, actually. It is 131 pages, so yeah, just a quick one. It's actually not a quick one because it's quite hard to digest, but it's not got that many pages. And yeah, going in, I didn't really have many expectations. The blurb suggests that it is about a band of savage 13-year-old boys reject the adult world as illusionary, hypocritical and sentimental, and train themselves in a brutal callousness they call objectivity. Now, similarly to A Single Rose, actually, the book felt a little bit wishy-washy, and the real standout moments for me were these horrible, grotesque moments of cruelty and violence. And I think for that reason, the book generally just doesn't sit very well with me. I'm not really sure what the point of the like gory violence was. And like my main takeaway from it was of that violence and not of what I think the book was supposed to be about, and I think it gets lost because of that overt grotesqueness, and as a personal opinion, I didn't really see the point of it. I thought it made the rest of the book seem a little bit lost because I didn't really get the point of the rest of it. And there were moments, quite small moments, where I thought it was making interesting comments about the transition from childhood to adulthood, but like I said, they were just lost on me because I was focusing too much on the bits that I didn't enjoy. So I'd probably give this like 2.5, maybe rounded up to 3 stars overall. Okay, next up was the July pick for Amy's book club, and that was The Dead Romantics by Ashley Poston. I loved this book. So it's a romance. It centres on a girl called Florence Day who can see ghosts. She lives in New York, but she comes from this really small town, and she hasn't been back there for 10 years because of an event that happened due to the fact she can see ghosts. Ever since she moved to New York, she sort of avoids the fact she can see ghosts. She doesn't do anything to help them. She just tries to ignore them as best as she can. But an event happens which means she has to go back to her hometown. Now, just before leaving, she meets her new editor, because Florence is a ghostwriter, and she meets her new editor, who is called Benji. They have a very brief interaction, but Florence finds him quite attractive, and yeah, is left and leaves in a hurry because she needs to go back. When she goes back, having not been there for very long, she sees Benji's ghost and realises that he has died. But Benji isn't ready to move on, and Florence knows that she's got to help him with whatever he needs to do before he can move on. So the book, I think, has two main elements to it. The first is the romance element between Florence and Benji, which was really great. I think when we talked about it in my book club, I did say that I think Florence was definitely the more fleshed out three-dimensional character. Benji felt more of a bit of a stereotype of a man rather than an actual man. It didn't matter too much because it was just a romance, and I didn't need to overthink it. The other element to the book is grief. Now, the reason that Florence has to go back to the town surrounds that massively, and the way that the book deals with grief is really beautiful, because obviously it's all tied into the fact that she can see ghosts as well. So she has a different perspective on grief, because when people die, it isn't necessarily the last time she's going to see them. So elements of that were really great. Florence's family as a unit were really brilliant. She's got a couple of brothers and sisters, and her mum and her dad as well, so I loved seeing them as characters. I thought they were all really well done, and they all kind of served their own purpose. I would love to see a sequel with her family more, because they were all great characters, but they were just like side characters, because the book really was about Florence and Benji. So yeah, for me, it was a beautiful rumination on grief. I really loved the way it did the romance. It just ticked a lot of boxes and did things really well, so I gave it 5 stars. And next up is another sort of romance, and that is We Are Inevitable by Gail Forman. I read this on audio as well. I've read a couple of other Gail Forman books. The one that comes to mind is If I Stay, and then I think I've read the sequel to that, but I can't remember what it's called. I read that a long time ago, so I don't particularly remember what I thought about that book or about her, but I think I liked it. And I just wanted another romance to read, so that is why I picked this up. The book mainly centres on Aaron. Aaron's parents split up for reasons you find out in the book, and his dad and himself live in the bookstore that his parents used to run. So they have to keep this bookstore going, and the bookstore is not doing very well, mainly because his dad isn't a very good businessman, and Aaron really wants to be able to lift them from the financial troubles that they are in. So Aaron decides that he is going to sell the store and doesn't tell his dad about it. So that is kind of one element to the book. The other element is that when he goes to a concert with his friend, he meets the lead singer of the band that they go to see, and immediately falls in love with her. So they're the sort of two parts to the book, and there are other characters and other elements to it too, but I think they're the two things I focused on. Now, obviously I loved it because it was set in a bookstore. It spoke a lot about books, and the title We Are Inevitable also comes back a lot during the plot. It's something that Aaron says a lot. He talks about inevitability and about how inevitability ties itself into his own life and other people's lives as well. And there were a lot of other interesting topics that were explored. So his friend is disabled. He was in an accident and paralysed in the accident. So it talks about his disability, but also the surgeries that he might want to do in order to restore some of his function. He talks about his brother's drug addiction as well, and goes into detail about that. And then obviously Aaron's financial troubles with his father, and then his mother who has left them as well, and their relationship too. So there are a lot of things going on actually, and a lot of quite like heavy and deep topics too. Now, similarly, right back at the beginning of this video to the Meet Cute Diary, my main issue with the book is I didn't really like Aaron. I thought the side characters were really good. I especially liked his friend. I especially liked his mother, and I thought that there were a lot of really strong-willed and 3D characters. But on the side, I thought Aaron himself, again, similarly to the Meet Cute Diary, just made bad decisions, and it kind of just made me think, well, why would other people want to do anything for you when you don't treat them very well? So I didn't really love that, because I wanted to be able to root for him. I wanted to be able to hope that the story was going to end positively for him, but I lost interest a little bit because I didn't really like him as a character. So same with the Meet Cute Diary, I gave this 3 stars. Okay, 2 left. The first one is another Scribd original, which is A Letter to My Rage by Linda Yuknavitch. This, again, is only like an hour long, and it basically sums up everything that Linda is angry about in the world. So it discusses a lot. It discusses racism, homophobia, everything that happened during COVID, and from an American point of view, the poor decisions that the government made there, and how that affected people's lives. It discusses just like general injustices in the world and how people have to live with like these broken systems that aren't their fault, but they are having to live with the consequences of that, and like live on the poverty line or live in a way that just isn't ideal, and they shouldn't have to be scraping by, they shouldn't have to be living with these horrible issues and prejudices, but they have to because of these broken systems. So yeah, it essentially just discusses everything that she is angry about. I imagine for the author it was probably very cathartic. It is literally a letter to her rage. The book does what it says on the tin, and yeah, for that I can't be mad about any expectations because it was as transparent as it sounds. Yeah, and overall I don't really have much to say about it because it was just this letter to everything she's angry about, and I agreed with most of it, so I gave the book 4 stars. And the final book on my list is Leonard and Hungry Paul by Ronan Hession. This is my second Ronan Hession book this year because I read Panenka, I think in May, a couple of months ago. It wasn't that long ago, but I loved his writing style. I think Panenka as a plot, it was good, but it wasn't like incredible, but I adored the outlook that Hession had while he was writing, and the like tone and the spin that he put on the situations. And Leonard and Hungry Paul is exactly the same. I think the perspective is really what makes it. So the book is about 2 characters called Leonard and Hungry Paul. It's about their families and their friendship and just the lives that they lead. And the best way to describe this book, and probably Panenka as well, is it's just quiet. It is about 2 men living very quiet lives, having not much impact on the world, but just exploring how they live their life every day. And I just loved the beauty that it found in the mundane, and that is something that Panenka does as well. They're both really brilliant books from that perspective, and because of this perspective they both just make you feel very happy for the small things in life. There are so many moments of small joy in this book that just made my heart so full, like just playing a game of Scrabble and seeing the words that somebody puts down, or having a little inside joke with the people that you know, whether that's friends or family. And yeah, I really loved that, so I really enjoyed this book. I think the writing was even better than Panenka. I tabbed a fair few things because there were a few like quotable moments, so yeah, I have to give this 5 stars because I did really enjoy it. Okay, that is everything I read in July. This video has probably ended up quite long because it was 18 books, so there were a lot to get through. Like I said, there were quite a few 5-star reads in there, so I am very happy because I was not getting a lot of 5-star books up until this point, so I'm glad that we have boosted that a little bit. And hopefully that will continue into August. August I am solely reading translated books written by women because it is Women in Translation month in August, so I'm looking forward to seeing what I think of those books. I have 10 on my TBR, so I might end up reading more outside of the women translation, but I will definitely be trying to read those 10. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please like it and please subscribe to my channel, and I will see you next time. Bye!